Welcome back to my new video. As you saw, the aerodynamics of the car are not perfect. Again, I was out with some friends. I wasn't going for a real speed run. I just wanted to have some fun with the Slash, get used to the new gearing, and I pushed it a little bit too far and then it flew off. So I am going to have to change the suspension, the aerodynamics, to prevent it from flying off again. As you can see in the front, the aluminium plate is bent. There's a small opening between the body and the chassis plate. I am going to lower the front of the car a little bit so air doesn't get underneath it as much as possible. But in the rear, you can see it is a little bit higher up. But the difference is that the front is pretty stiff and the rear end is pretty soft. Due to the aerodynamics of the spoiler, it creates a lot of downforce. So the end or the rear end of the car is going to squat down before the front end of the car is going to squat down. And what you have is driving in an angle like this, so air can go underneath the car, and if it doesn't escape at the end, it's going to fly off. So I'm going to have to compensate that. So I'm going to lower the front end of the car, and I'm going to lower the rear end of the car, but also make it stiffer. And I'm going to put limiters in the shocks, so it can never get lower than the front of the car. Then I'm going to trim down the wing. It creates a lot of downforce, and I want it to create less downforce, so I'm going to trim down these a little bit, and this one. I'm not sure how much I'm going to trim it down. I'm going to have to see about that. Also, air can go underneath the body, and to let the air that comes in the body to escape easier, I'm going to drill some holes in the rear end of the car. The idea is that the air over the car is flowing faster than the air inside. So when the air goes to the end of the car, it creates a vacuum at the rear. So if I drill some holes in here, it is going to suck out the air in the body. So it creates a vacuum underneath the body. To prevent air from getting underneath the body, I'm going to make a new aluminium chassis plate. One that is obviously straight, because this one is bent due to the crash. I am also going to let it stick out a little bit, and I'm going to 3D print a wing up front, so that the air hits the wing before it hits the body, and there's no chance, or almost no chance, for air to go underneath the body in the front here. Also, it should help with the aerodynamics, because the front of the car is pretty blunt. So air is going to be pushed against it, and it creates a lot of drag. Then the chassis plate has these cutouts for the wheels, but as you can see, they're quite big, also in the front. So I am going to redesign the chassis plate so that these cutouts for the wheels are smaller, so there's less chance of air getting underneath the body. The reason these are quite big as they are now is because I've designed the chassis plate for X01 tires, but these are GPR tires, which are a little bit smaller. I am also going to cut off this rear mount, which is from the rally. It doesn't provide any function except for holding down the bulkhead and the stabilizing rod. So I'm going to cut it down here and here. So this goes off. Then I'm going to make a little bend in here so that the end of the chassis plate is facing upwards. So it creates, or it functions as a diffuser, but without the fins in it. Then if air is going to be stuck underneath the chassis plate, I am going to make some holes in the chassis plate with some 3D printed ducts so that the air can escape to the side. So air underneath the chassis can escape easier and quicker from under there. So the chance of riding on a cushion of air is reduced. So I'm going to 3D print wheel arches that go on top of the chassis plate and underneath the body. So this is closed up. Also in the front I'm going to do the same, because this is sticking out and it is collecting a lot of air on both sides. So I'm going to make wheel arches over here, and I'm going to think of a way to press this inwards a little bit so it doesn't scoop up as much air as it does. Then, due to the crash, the body posts are damaged and they are a little bit bent, so I'm going to have to fix that because this one doesn't fit anymore. These are all scraped off, so I'm going to have to fix that. The body overall doesn't sustain much damage, it's just scratched on the roof, but it's still usable. It's not torn apart or bent in any way. But first I'm going to adjust the suspension of the car in the front and in the rear. Then I can measure or remeasure the chassis plate, make a new one, and then I can work on my 3D prints, and then it's time for another run. How am I going to lower the car? Well, on the shaft of the shock absorber I'm going to place a rubber ring and some nylon spacers, which prevents the shaft from going outwards too much. I already had this one in, I'm going to put it back in also. And now the shock is limited and cannot go out all the way. If you compare it to this one, which is not lowered, you can see the difference in extension. So in the front I'm going to lower it 8 mm, and in the rear I'm going to lower it about 15 mm. So now that the shocks are set up, it's time to refill them, and for that I'm going to use 700 weight. Previously I had 700 weight in the front and 500 in the rear, but the rear was a little bit too soft, so I'm going to fill it up with 700 also. To fill up the shocks precisely, I'm going to use this syringe, and the idea is to fill up the shock absorber without air bubbles in the shock oil. And to do that, it is going to be a little bit trickier than normal, because now the piston is about halfway in. Normally it isn't, and it can go down all the way. So you lower the shock all the way down, you fill it up for about halfway, and then you wiggle the piston up and down just a little bit so it stays underneath the shock absorber fluid, and then all the air that is underneath the piston can escape. So you wiggle it up and down a little bit, you let it sit for half an hour, and then wiggle it some more. If there's no air coming out, you fill it up about 95–98%. You wiggle it a little bit more, and then all the air is out and you can put the cap on. But now the piston is halfway in, so I'm gonna have to fill it up for about 75%, wiggle it, and then wait a little bit longer, because the more shock oil there's in there, the longer it is going to take for all the air to go out. Also, when you use thicker shock oil, it's going to take longer. So I have filled up the shock, and now I'm going to wiggle the piston a little bit so that the air can escape, or the shock absorber fluid can go underneath the piston. So let me wiggle it up and down just a little bit, and you can already see some air going out, and you can see that the level of shock absorber fluid is sinking. So now it is going underneath the piston. Now let me put in some new fluid, fill it up. And then wiggle it some more. And you can see those small bubbles, that's air. So I'm going to let that set, and I'm going to go over the other shock absorbers. Here you can see all the air bubbles. Now this one. Here you can see all the air bubbles floating to the top. So I've let the shock sit down. Now let's see if all the air is out. So I'm gonna wiggle the piston up and down and see if any air comes up. If not, then the shocks are ready. Well, the first one was good. This one has still some air in there. Third one also has a little bit of air inside. And the fourth one also has a little bit of air inside. So I'm gonna let it stand for another 20–25 minutes, wait until the air came up, and then try it again. So let's check again. First one obviously still good, second one is good, third one is good, and the fourth one is almost good. So I'm gonna fill up the second and the third shock absorber. I'm gonna take out a little bit from the first one because I think it's a little bit too full. And the fourth one, I'm gonna let it sit for another 20 minutes for the air to come out. But for the first three, I'm gonna close them up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the shock cap and put the rubber in there gently. Be careful pressing down the rubber cap without damaging it, otherwise the shock is going to leak. And you want to press it down all the way. Now I'm gently gonna screw the cap of the shock absorber on there. And when I compress it, I want it to come out by itself just a little bit. And it does. Now when you move the piston up and down, you want it to be smooth and without any noise. When you hear a crunching sound, it can be one of two things. Your shock absorber is not clean from the inside, there's dirt in there. Or there's air inside the shock absorber. And the crunching noise you hear is the air going through the piston. And that's what is making the noise. This one is also coming out by itself a little bit. Third one, and then I can check up on the fourth one and see if all the air is out. So the third one is also okay. Now let's check the fourth one for air. That's good. So now let's fill it up. Just a few drops. That's a little bit too much, so I can take out a little bit with the syringe. And let's close that up. And this one is also not making any noise, so there's no air or dirt in there. And the piston comes out by itself just a little bit. So those are ready to be used again. Well, almost. I'm gonna clean them because I've spilled oil everywhere, greasy finger, stuff like that. So I'm gonna clean them and then put the springs on there and then put them back on the slash. I've also put all the parts that came off the shocks in some degreasant with hot water, and as you can see there's a lot of, well, not a lot, but there is some dirt coming off. They were not that dirty, but still it's not clean and green anymore, it's a little bit brown in between. Now let's clean the shocks. So all the parts that are going onto the shocks are cleaned and dried. Now I'm going to start with connecting the eyes to the shock absorber shaft. And in order to fasten them properly, you have to screw them on all the way. But at least I am not strong enough to hold the piston, so I'm going to use a tool to clamp it down, but I am going to put some paper towels in between them so that I'm not going to damage the shaft of the shock absorber while holding it down, and then I can screw it on all the way. While assembling the shock absorber, you're going to start with the ring that holds the spring, and then put the other ring on there to complete it. I had some pre-spring added to it to stiffen up the shock. I'm gonna hold down the spring and then push these on the body of the shock absorber. And this is the first spring and it's quite stiff. And while putting the shock absorbers back together, I realized that I have limited how far the piston can extend, or the spring, because I've put the rings inside the shock absorber. Shortens the total length of the shock absorber with the spring. So to recreate the same stiffness, I don't have to put as much pre-spring in there as I did before.
So I'm going to take out one ring on the front shock absorbers, and for the rear I'm not going to even mount these. So I'm going to put this aside. I'm going to put this on the slash, and then we'll see what the right height is, how stiff it is. But before I put on the springs, I'm gonna have to look into the differential. Maybe because of the crash, something damaged inside, or maybe I just need to shim it correctly or put some grease in there. So I'll open it up and then we'll see. So the differential looks good, all the teeth are still intact. Now let's feel if it needs to be shimmed or if it only needs to be lubricated. Well, it doesn't immediately looks like or feels like it needs to be shimmed, so I'm going to start with some grease and then go from there. Just going to take off the grease that is on there. I'm not going to completely degrease it with brake cleaner or anything else. Just going to wipe it off. I'm going to put new grease on the gears. Clean the bearings a little bit. Well, there was not much grease on there. So I'm going to use this spray for two reasons. It is easy to apply. And for the second reason is that when it is evaporated, not the grease but the chemicals inside that make it thin so you can use it from a can, when those are evaporated, the grease is really thick and sticky, so it should last longer on the differentials, because when you drive your RC car really fast, the differential is going to spin really fast. And because of the forces of the rotation, the grease is going to fly off the teeth of the gears. And then eventually you're going to run dry. When the grease is more sticky, it's going to stay longer on the gears and it is going to be lubricated longer. So now it's time to put the differential back in and see if it is running smoothly or if it is still making that crunching noise. That's a whole lot better. So I'm going to keep it like this. Now I'm going to cut the rear bumper mount, or actually I'm going to cut it over here, and I'm just going to unscrew this piece. I'm also going to take the wing off to trim that one down. I'll head downstairs to my shed where all the electric tools are to cut the rear bumper and the wing. So I've trimmed down the spoiler here and here. I have trimmed down the underside of the spoiler that the edge is gone, and I've smoothened the sides that were banged up due to the crash. And I have the rear bumper mount, or the rear mount, which was original for the rally. I've cut it down so I can put it back in. So I just realized that the shocks are limited on how far they can extend, but not limited in how far they can compress. So by lowering the car, there's a chance that the wheel bumps up too much, that it is going to lose contact with the ground, or that the chassis plate is going to touch the ground. But maybe on the other hand, I don't have to worry too much about that, because I'm only planning to drive on really flat surfaces. So I'll just let that be for now, and when I hear the slash scraping on the ground, I'm going to add limiters in the compression. Well, it isn't the cleanest cut, but it is a cut. So let's move on to the rest of the slash. Rear suspension is done, now the front.
This is it for this week's video. Try to keep it as short as possible, but due to the amount of information that I want to give you guys and show to you, the video is well over half an hour long. Rebuilding the slash completely is just too much work for 1 week. I just finished the rear suspension, now it's time for the front. I have to redesign the chassis plate, then make it. Making it costs time. I need to hire cutting time on the sheet metal laser, which goes according to a schedule. Normally I have to wait between 1 or 2 weeks before I can cut my plates. After I redesign the chassis plate, I have to wait 2 weeks before I have it in. Then I have to fit it on the slash, test it. If that works, then I can work on the 3D prints. So I'm going to rebuild the slash step by step. But I am going to do all the points that I've mentioned. After all, I want fast, reliable slash. One that can drive at top speed at any time. So it's going to take time to do it correctly. So this is it for this week's video. I hope you enjoyed my video and I'll see you in the next one.